Well, yes, we've been going through the Gospel of John, so I want to invite you to open up to Gospel of John on your iPhone or on your hard copy. If you don't have a Bible, you can slip your hand up right now if you don't have a Bible, and someone will bring a Bible around to you. Anyone don't have one? There's one at the back, so we'll just grab a Bible for you, and you can open up to John chapter 12, and this morning, this is an incredible story. John chapter 12, verse 1 through to 8, and I'm going to read it out for you right now, and read along with me. Verse 1 of chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" And he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." Well, on federal election day this year in Australia, I went to cast my vote, and everyone has a strategy about what time of the day you'll go and cast your vote. Some people think, well, I'll get it out of the way early in the morning because I'll try and beat the crowd. Me, I just was busy that day, and so I left it quite late, and it got sort of toward the end of the day, and I went to the school that I go every year, every time the federal election's on, to go and cast my vote. And I rocked up, and the car park was packed, and there was like a line around the block. And so I took my spot in the line and just waited and waited until I finally got up to, the table with the lady sitting at it where they mark your name off the roll before you go and vote. And you remember this, Simone? And I saw Simone and Luke there. Anyway, I went up to the table, and there was this lady, and I said, I told her my name, and she was looking for my name on the electoral roll, and it wasn't there. And I'm thinking, what the heck? Why isn't my name on the electoral roll? Maybe I'm actually enrolled in the other electorate. I've been in a few different suburbs, lived in a few. Maybe I'm in another electorate. So I got on the phone to Michelle and I said, which electorate am I enrolled in? And she didn't know. And so the line was kind of backing up, and I kind of lost my spot in the line. I thought, oh no, maybe I'll jump in my car and I'll go to the other electorate, the neighboring electorate, and I'll go there. So anyway, I got back in my car. I drove all the way to that electorate, and the car park was packed, and there was another 30-minute line. And so I just waited in the 30-minute line. I got to the end of the line, the lady sitting there where she marks your name off, and guess what? My name was not on the electoral roll. And I was really frustrated. I'm like, what is going on with my name not being on the electoral roll? Anyway, I found out a long time later, that what happens is the Electoral Commission, if they suspect that you're living in a different suburb, they'll actually send you a letter and just to confirm where you live. And so obviously, because we were living in America or something like that, we received that letter, but we didn't actually reply to it. And if you don't reply to it, they'll actually take your name off the roll. And so I think what's happened is my name has actually been struck off the roll. I'm not on there. I don't exist. And anyway, so this official comes over and says, okay, you come over here. So I go over into this special booth. And I fill out all my details, and then I cast my vote, and I watch her. She kind of wraps it up in a bag and puts rubber bands around it and stuffs it into this bag. And as I'm walking off, out of the thing, I'm looking back. I'm like, is my vote going to count? It's in this sort of dodgy bag over in the corner. Is my vote actually going to count? I actually walked out of there thinking, I don't know if my vote is actually going to count in this election, in electing our local member who will elect our Prime Minister. This got me thinking, so often in our lives, this is a picture of our lives. We actually have this doubt as we look at all this activity that we're doing, all this effort that we go to for various different things in our life. We can actually come to this point in our mind thinking, is what I'm doing, does it actually count? Does it actually count for anything? Does my life actually count for Christ? Am I making it count? The thing is that we know about the gospel is that we know that it's not about what we do and how much our life really counts in order for God to accept us. We all know this. We've heard this in church all the time. That's not the basis on which we're saved. We're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, and this is not of our own doing. This is the gift of God. This is God's salvation. Salvation belongs to our God, not us. But there is a sense in the Bible which we should all acknowledge and which Paul constantly talks about in all his letters, that there is a sense in which we do have to make our lives count for Christ. There are all sorts of imperatives in the New Testament which call us to obey and to make our lives really count for Christ. Paul says in Philippians 1 verse 27, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. What's Paul actually saying? He's saying, guys, make it count. You're not saved by that, but you are called to make your life count for Christ. I think all of us actually know this. In our heart, we have this kind of shape in our heart that does actually want to make our life count. But I think we often have a misunderstanding about what that means. And so I want to go through 3 myths that we actually face that makes us think that, whether or not we're going to make our life count or not. The first one is this: I must know much. I must know much. If I'm going to make my life count, the way that I will make my life count is if I know much. I went off to study. I thought that, I would fill my mind up with theology and studying the Bible, and that's a very good thing to do. But there was actually a little bit of an inkling in me and a motivation throughout that period of time is that I'm not really going to be able to make it really count in ministry in my life unless I know much. I look at all these different preachers in America. I was exposed to all these great guys and all this sort of stuff. I'm thinking, man, I'm never going to make it count like they do. They're amazing. I'm never going to be able to have the impact that they have unless I know much. And so this is one of the myths about making our life count. I must know much, but it also leads to a second thing. Not only that I must know much, but also I must be known much. You see, it's not just enough to know, you also need to be recognized for what you know. You see, it wasn't just good enough for me to go off and, fill up my mind with all this theology and understanding, but I also wanted the certificate with the university seal on it that said, Andrew Green has this degree. I must be known for what I know. Often what good is it if you just fill up your mind, you go through your life just filling up your mind, but no one actually recognizes you for what you know. And so we actually think that to make it count in our life, we must be recognized for what we know. But then this leads to a third myth. What good is it to just know a lot and to be known for knowing a lot, but not actually own much? That you actually get to the end of your life and you have nothing to show for it. So this kicks us into gear on a third level. I must actually own much. If I'm going to really make it count in my life, then I need to get to the end of my life and say, look at everything I have. I've paid off my house and I have this wonderful, successful family and I have enough for my retirement. And all these types of things that we fall into, these are myths. Because you know what? The Bible shows us over and over and over and over again. As you scan the pages of the Bible, this is what you will find. That you don't have to know much. You don't have to be known much, and you don't have to own much to make it count in your life. If you want your life to count, pour it out. If you want your life to really count for Christ, it's not about what you know. It's not about whether you're known. It's not about how much you own. It's about all those things, all those blessings, everything that you've received in Christ, and pouring it out. That's what will actually make your life count when you get to the end of your life. Now, how do we do this? How do we actually pour it out? That's what I want to go through as we look at this story. The first thing, how do we actually make it count, is that you actually pour it out on rising needs. Have a look in chapter 11, verse 54, and notice this about Jesus. This is the setup to this story here in chapter 12. Verse 54, it says, Jesus, therefore, no longer openly walked among the Jews. Why did he do this? Well, what we've seen, as we've seen all along with John, the light comes into the world in chapter 1, and then gradually, as you see, go along in John, you see Jesus doing these things and doing these miracles. John calls them signs, signs that Jesus is the Son of God. We've seen this all the way along. And in the first 4 chapters, you kind of see this kind of inquisitiveness by people. They're kind of just like looking to see who this is. But then when you get to chapter 5, the hostility comes. You start seeing the Jews noticing what Jesus is doing, and they say, we will not have this. We need to put an end to this. And so you see a rising hostility happen at chapter 5 until chapter 11, which we looked at last week. Jesus performs his ultimate miracle in John's gospel. He raises a man from the dead. He raises Lazarus up from the dead. And at this point, the Jews, the chief priests, are like, we will not have this. We will now plot to kill Jesus. There is now a contract on his life. And so what we're seeing here is Jesus is in need. Jesus is actually in desperate need. We've seen all the way through John, my hour has not yet come, my hour has not yet come. And right here, even though it's close, his hour has still not yet come. Jesus is actually in great need. And this is what we see here with his friends. His friends gather around Jesus and they take him to a town called Bethany. It's about 2 miles east of Jerusalem. So you imagine like a city, like the city of Adelaide. Bethany was like a suburb. And so this is where Jesus' friends lived. And so they took Jesus into this house here in Bethany and they served him. And they met his needs. It's actually a beautiful picture. Jesus is just about to go to the cross. And just before he goes to the cross, they get this wonderful opportunity to serve and to bless him and to honor him for what he's done. They're pouring out it on rising needs. And the thing I love about this picture, right, is that these friends of Jesus, they had every reason not to. They had every reason not to. Now, this is what happens. There are always reasons for you not to pour your life out on rising needs. There's always reasons, right? And often those reasons, what we do is we turn them into excuses. So there's always factors. What about my needs? What about what I'm facing? What about what I'm going through? I can't meet their rising needs because I've got rising needs. But what happens is there's always reasons. But we can't let those reasons turn into excuses for not doing anything, for seeing rising needs and saying, no, just ignoring them. But what you see here is Jesus' friends don't do that. They have reasons. Here's their reason, right? Have a look in chapter 12, verse 10. Verse 10, it says, so the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well. Lazarus has already been dead once. And now they're going to have another crack at putting Lazarus to death. Why? Because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. So what's their reason? Their reason is that there is a contract out to kill them. Their life is at risk. They had reason, but they don't make an excuse. They actually take Jesus and they take him into Bethany at great risk to them. And they serve him and they pour out their life on rising needs. Do you want to make your life count? Pour your life out on rising needs around you. Find a sick person and help them. Find a ministry and join it. Find a church and give. Find a lonely person and be their friend. Find a bad situation and pray for it. If you want your life to count, you've got to pour it out. pour it out on rising needs. The second way that you make your life count is to pour it out with rising thankfulness. Pour it out with rising thankfulness. Have a look in verse 1. I want to set the scene for you. 6 days before the Passover. So you have to get this scene right. This is basically the Saturday night before Jesus is about to go to the cross. Everything is gearing up, ramping up to Jesus' hour. 6 days before the Passover. Now, what is the Passover? Well, we know that Jesus dies at the time of the Passover, at the time of the feast. But what is the Passover? You have to go back to Exodus, where you see the Pharaoh of Egypt. He has control. He's enslaved the Israelite people, and he's a stubborn man. He's a hard-hearted man. He will not let his fist be pried open to let the people go. And so God appoints Moses, no one significant, didn't know much, wasn't known much, didn't own much, but sends someone like Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And so Moses goes to him, let my people go, let my people go. And time after time, he refuses to let his people go because of his stubbornness. And so God sends a plague after plague after plague to try and pry open Pharaoh's fist. But he will not. 9 plagues down. And so finally, God delivers the death blow. And the death blow is that for every firstborn child, as the angel of death sweeps through the city, that he will kill every firstborn child except for those houses where there is the blood of a lamb sprinkled on the doorpost of the house. And so what we see is the angel of death comes through, and for every house that where the blood is sprinkled on the doorpost, God spares the firstborn child. But for every house that doesn't have it, every child it wakes up. They wake up in the morning and the child is dead. And Pharaoh is so grieved that he actually finally lets his fist open and lets the people go. God delivers them out of Egypt through the Red Sea. And this is an incredible picture. This is a God-ordained picture of the gospel, isn't it? Because what we know with the benefit of full revelation is that for every person who is sprinkled with the blood of Jesus on their life, God will pass over their sins. He will pass over their death sentence because of what Jesus has done. This is the incredible picture of the Passover, that Jesus is the blood sacrifice. That's what you see here in this verse. But not only do you see the blood sacrifice here, we also see a resurrection here. You see, in this scene, the setting of this scene, it says that Lazarus was whom Jesus had raised from the dead. This is what we saw last week. So what we see is that Jesus actually has the power over death. And so what we have is we have a blood sacrifice, and we also have a resurrection. And this is what we see in Jesus. But not only do we see a blood sacrifice and a resurrection, we also see a healing. You see, in the parallel passages in Matthew and Mark, this story is in 2 other spots. It's in Matthew and it's in Mark, and they're both the same story. You get some more detail. And the detail in that story is that this house actually belonged to someone called Simon the leper, who Jesus healed. Now, every time in the New Testament, when you're reading through the New Testament and you see a story about leprosy, you can see that as a sure sign of representing sin. That's what leprosy is. It's a flesh-eating disease. That's what sin does to us. It consumes our flesh. And so leprosy is this kind of representation of sin. So what we have in this scene here is not only a blood sacrifice, not only a resurrection, but we also have a healing. And this is actually what we have in the gospel. We have a blood sacrifice, Jesus who's laid his life down for us, and the blood sprinkles over us so that God passes over our sins, passes over our death sentence. But also that we have a God, Jesus, who has resurrected from the death, signifying his power over death. And because of those two things, we by faith have a healing. We are cleansed from our sins. Amen? Amen. This is the beautiful picture that's happening here. And so verse 2 of chapter 12, this is the grand statement. So they gave a dinner for him there. They gave a dinner for him. Why the dinner? Because they want to do it in his honor. because he has raised their brother from the dead. This is our motivation for pouring our life out, to pour it out with rising thankfulness because of what Jesus has done for us. You know, so often we can do the things that we do. We can serve in the church, and we can almost sort of do it begrudgingly, or because we're on a roster, or for all these sorts of things. But God actually wants us to do it out of rising thankfulness to Him. First to the King. First to the King. We pour out our lives for Him. You know, we have this one great life-changing reason to pour it out, don't we? Because of what Jesus has done for us. So pour it out on rising needs, but pour it out with rising thankfulness. Some of you need to take what you've been filled up with in your life, all the blessings, the gospel that has come to you, and you are filled up, and you actually need to pour it out. You need to pour it out with rising thankfulness. You need to go home this afternoon and say, thank you, Lord. I want to serve you with my life. I want to pour out of rising thankfulness. Thirdly, you have to pour it out despite rising cost. Despite the rising cost. This week in America was Thanksgiving. Probably saw different posts on Facebook. And as I saw that, it got me thinking about last year. We were there at Thanksgiving last year. It was our sort of first experience of that. And everything that happens at Thanksgiving, it's as big as Christmas. It's just this huge thing. And all the students, they go back to their homes and they have beautiful celebration, big meal. International students, you just try and tack on with a family. You just try and get involved in a family and have that experience. And I remember it was the day before Thanksgiving last year. We had a class, and there was this Indian guy that I hadn't really met, and we were sitting there in a room and just talking, and I was just asking a bit about him and what he was doing for Thanksgiving, stuff like that, and he was telling me a little bit about it. And then we got talking, and I asked him more about himself, and he took out of his wallet a photo of his wife and his kids. And these two young children, a beautiful wife, and I just got talking to him and said, mate, so how are you going? How's your family going settling into America? And he goes, I could see him kind of go a bit quiet and silent, and I sort of saw him, get a little bit emotional. He said, oh, actually, they're still back in India, and I haven't seen them for 2 years. And I just remember having this conversation that my stomach just dropped. And, everyone around him, he's just watching people having Thanksgiving and going off with their families and all that sort of stuff. And it can actually be quite a lonely time if you don't live there and you don't have family. And he's sitting there and he said, I said, oh man, tell me a bit about your story and about why you came. And he said, my wife and I, a couple of years ago, we just believed, we have a heart for our nation, India, where there's hardly any Christians, and we just decided that I wanted to go away and I wanted to get trained, and so we could come back to India and spread the gospel through churches and church planting in India. And so we couldn't afford all the money to bring the whole family over, so we just decided to send me, and my family are staying with some other family and things like that, but I haven't seen them for 2 years. And he was just so emotional at this time. And as I was listening to him, my eyes just welled up, and I felt like, I don't think I actually did, but I felt like saying to him, thank you. What a cost. What a cost he is paying. Because his heart is for Jesus. His heart is inflamed for the gospel. And he's looking at his two kids in this photo, and he hasn't seen them for 2 years, and they're just young children. But he's making this sacrifice because he wants to go back to his nation, and he wants to see churches planted, and he wants to preach, and he wants to see people get saved. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, for your Lord, your Savior. And may God bring you back together, and it be a wonderful celebration. That's what I remember as I walked away thinking that. And this is what we see. As I read this week, my heart went straight to that scenario, because that is the picture of what happens here. where Mary, she therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus, and she wiped his feet with her hair. And what you see here is, you see a woman step into a room. She undoes her hair, which is the most shameful thing to do. She walks into a room, she says, I don't care the cost. I don't care about the hit to my pride. You know, in those days, you would actually, to honor someone, you would anoint their head. But she gets down low in humility and she washes his feet with her hair. She's walking in a room saying, I don't care what it costs. Later on in this story, we see that the ointment, the perfume, is worth 300 denarii. The people in those days earned one denarius a day. And so this is a year's worth of salary. This is $50,000, her opening the alabaster jar and pouring it over Jesus' feet without a care to her reputation, without a care to her possessions and what she owns and what she has. She's poured it out for Jesus. She's poured it out despite the cost. You know, when my friend in India was telling me about this story, about his life and what he was doing, and when I read the result of Mary's humility and her sacrifice this week, look at the result. It says that the room, where is it? It says that the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. That was the best description of what it was like talking to that guy, that Indian guy. As he poured out his heart and said what he was doing, when I read that this way, I'm like, that's what it was like. It was like the fragrance of his sacrifice, what he was willing to pay the cost for. It just like filled up the room with God's presence there, saying, yes, that's what I desire, that type of sacrifice. You know, this is Mary of Bethany. She's a simple Jewish girl. She didn't know much. She wasn't known much. She didn't own much, but what she had, she poured out despite the cost. She was willing to pay the rising cost. You know, so often we look at our lives and all the material things that we pursue and that we have, and we need to count the cost. We need to look at what we have and say, man, we're so blessed. We need to challenge our hearts. We need to give more sacrificially. We need to open up our lives. We need to cast away our pride. You know, looking, stupid for following Jesus. We need to cast away our pride. No matter how difficult it gets. I don't know how difficult it's going to get to serve Jesus in our country. I don't know. But we need to serve no matter how difficult it gets. You know, I was thinking this week, we need to take our cue. Some of us younger ones, myself included, we need to take our cue from some of our older ones amongst us. As I look out and some of our older people here, man, all I'm seeing is 30 to 40 years of faithful, unhindered, passionate service for God. You know, wherever the church goes and wherever that pastor leads who's led by God, they go. And they serve and they get around through their giving and through their using their skills and through just being faithfully present. And all these things, people who are willing to pay the cost. I look out and I think, man, yeah, I see that. I see some of our older ones just doing that, just paying the cost, constantly paying the cost. Some of us younger ones, myself included, we got to follow that call. We got to say, what's our vision? What's our vision? Are we gonna just keep on going despite the cost that it is for us? This is such a challenge for us. Are we going to pour it out in our lives despite the rising cost? You know, fourthly, pour it out. Have I done all my things? Pour it out through rising criticism. That's what you see next. Judas interjects. Verse 4. What are you doing? What a waste. That stuff's worth 300 denarii. We could have used it for the poor. He's not interested in the poor. Judas has his hand in the till. He's got his hand in the bag. And he's not interested in the poor, but he's making this big grandstanding thing like, what are you doing? This is a waste. You know, we should use this for something better, namely me. And you know, often what we do when we come to this, we read things about Judas. I mean, who likes Judas? No one likes Judas, right? You read in the Bible, you read something about Judas. We hate Judas. What was Judas's price? 30 pieces of silver. So you got Mary pouring out a year's worth of salary. You got Judas saying, 30 pieces of silver to betray my best friend. No one likes Judas. This is the comparison here in the text between Mary and Judas. But we all tend to point the finger at Judas, but maybe, first of all, we should actually go, what about my Judas heart? I want to tell you something really, really personal, you know, like an inner working of the heart thing, all right? Don't tell anyone. You know, every year on Grand Final Day, AFL Grand Final Day, I watch the Grand Final. I love football. You know I love football. I love the game. I don't just love the Crows. I love the game. I'm passionate about it. And so football season comes to an end. Grand Final Day comes. And I watch the game and I see all these young men about a bit younger than me and about my age, right? And the winning team are when they win, they are on the mountain. Like, this is the pinnacle of their lives. And I sit there and I watch them and they're jumping on each other. They're having the time of their lives. And I look at it and then I imagine, okay, what's going to happen for them? Like, they're going to have the best party tonight. They've got these epic salaries. So basically what they're going to do is they're all going to go on these epic trips around the world, their lifestyle, their whole thing. And I look at it, the fame, the glory that they have, all that sort of stuff at the MCG with 100,000 people in the whole country that stops to watch them. And I actually look at that and I feel a bit flat every year. Because I look upon it and I go, man, I wish that was me. I wish I actually, I want their life. I want what they're experiencing, what they're about to experience. And my own heart, and I'm like, man, like, you look at people like that, they're having a great time, and me, like, well, I'm not that excited about what I've chosen. I'm not saying that they're necessarily doing bad things and whatever, but not judging them. But my own heart is like, I wish I could just go and be free and have all these great things. What's my heart telling my own heart in that moment? It's saying, you're wasting it. It's a Judas heart that says, what a waste. Don't pour your life out for Jesus. Don't worry about that. It's this Judas heart that says, do what you want. Put your hand in the till. Take some for yourself. And so we actually have to look at our own Judas heart before we think about the Judases from the outside. But the Judases will come from the outside too. This is Judas actually from the outside saying, what is she doing? She's wasting her time. And this is what will happen to you in your life. If you decide to pour out your life for Jesus, this is what will come. People will look at what you're doing and they'll say, what a waste. Do other things. Live a little bit. I remember when I left my job in the government in 2012. And this lady who was kind of loosely connected to religion in her life and all those sorts of stuff, she found out what I was doing, going into ministry, pastoral ministry. And she actually took me out for coffee, right? And she sat me down and she said, what are you doing? Like, you've been doing this for 10 years. Like, you've actually built something. In a couple of years' time, you'll move on. You're going to go up the ranks. Are you sure you want to do this? This is crazy. I mean, I kind of go to church and I do things. You can still believe, but come on, don't chuck this away. If you decide to pour out your life for Christ, you're going to have criticism. You're going to have Judases on the outside saying, that's a waste. Don't do that. And what I'm not talking about here right now is going into full-time vocational ministry. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking like that is the ultimate sign of pouring out your life. What I'm saying is it's being you being submitted to God's call on your life. Whatever it is, whatever God's calling you to, you'll actually be submitted to God. Say, God, I will do this. I'm a nurse, and I will do that for your glory. I will do that with all I have. I am just a faithful church member. I will pour out my life here. It's not about full-time vocational ministry, but it's about just doing it through rising criticism. So what does Jesus do? How does Jesus actually intervene on our Judas heart and from criticism from outside? How does Jesus actually deal with this? This is awesome. You ready for some awesomeness? This is awesome. Jesus stands up in verse 7 and he says, leave her alone. Leave her alone. What reasons does he give for leaving her alone? First, 3 reasons. One, she's kept it from my burial. So many commentators debate this. They're like, did she have a little bit left until Jesus was resurrected or, buried and then pour it on him? Or, is it just that it's so close to his death that you'd actually be able to smell it on him even 6 days later? Like, the commentators argue about what that actually means. And I'm not going to answer that for you. So we're just going to skip to the next reason. Number 2, you'll always have the poor. So Jesus is saying that the poor is important. And number 3, but you won't always have me. What's going on here? Many people try and create a theology of caring for the poor out of this verse. Like, it looks like Jesus doesn't care for the poor here. Because Jesus says, you'll always have the poor, but you won't always have me. So, people tend to, like far right-wing people say, don't worry about the poor. Jesus didn't care about the poor, serve Jesus. That's all you do. But Jesus is actually saying the opposite. Jesus is actually saying the poor are very important. Serve the poor. But I am uniquely and supremely important. Pour it out for me. Pour it out for me. This is what Jesus is saying here. He is very much putting himself first. But this is the encouraging thing. This is why you're actually going to be able to pour it out with confidence when you pour your life out. Because Jesus stands up, he says, leave her alone. What's he saying? He's saying, she's made the right choice. She's made the right choice in putting me first. He affirms her priorities. This is what Jesus is always going to do to you. Because he loves you, because you are his, because you and him are one, you are united. Whenever your Judas heart springs up, or whenever someone from out you is chirping in your ear saying, what a waste, Jesus will step in and say, leave her, leave him alone. He is making the right decision in putting me first. You can pour it out with confidence. I believe that. That is a personal experience of mine. When I have stepped out in faith that way, God will always come and affirm to me, yes, you are making the right decision, even when it's tough. Even when the cost is high and the criticism is coming, put me first. The last question to ask is, will it be worth it? Will it be worth it? And we're going to sing now. We're going to wrap this up and we're going to sing, so we invite the guys to come. But I want you just to listen to this story that John Piper tells. Will it be worth it? All right? Listen to this story. In April of 2000, it's a lady called Ruby Eliason and Laura Edwards were killed in Cameroon, West Africa. Ruby was over 80. She was single all her life. She poured her life out for one great cause, to make Jesus Christ known among the unreached, among the poor and the sick. Laura, her offsider, was a widow. She was a medical doctor. And she was pushing 80 years old, and she was serving at Ruby's side in Cameroon. One day, these two elderly ladies, they were riding in the car, and the brakes failed in the car, and the car goes over the cliff, and they die. And Piper asked this congregation, he says, was this a tragedy? Was that a tragedy? Two lives driven by one great passion, making Jesus known. Get to the end of their life, 80, they've just poured it out for him. Decades after, all their American, counterparts or the people their own age are probably, living on their retirement and all that sort of stuff. And Piper says that's not a tragedy. That's not a tragedy. Mark 8:35 says, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it in the end. This is no tragedy. This is glory. They made their lives count. They've poured it out. And this is what Piper says. He says, this is the tragedy, all right? Let me read you another story. The tragedy. February 1998 edition of Reader's Digest tells boastingly about a couple who took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years earlier when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball and collect seashells. Live a good life, save up for retirement. You know, the last season of your life before you're about to meet God, the Creator, you spend it on a 30-foot trawler and playing softball and seashells, and so you get to the Lord, you stand before the Lord, look at my seashell collection. Look what I've collected. And Piper's like, that's the tragedy. That will be the tragedy. You know, we've been talking this morning a lot about some of those real high things, you know, those big things that you can do. Like, preachers always use those like examples of, you know, the people that die and the missionaries and the people that give their lives up and all that sort of stuff. And sometimes it's a bit hard to relate to, right? You don't have to be a missionary to Africa to make it count in your life. Remember, Paul said, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of God. And I was just reflecting on it this week. What sort of people is Paul talking about? Well, if you have a look in Colossians 4, you see this list of unsung heroes. You know, all through the Bible, when we talk about messages like this, you know, look at Moses, look at Joshua, you know, stood up strong, be strong and courageous. I'm just not like that. I'm not that sort of person. Look at David and the grand glories of David. Look at the Apostle Paul. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. He's standing on the mountain. You think, oh, I'm actually more like where are you, God, type of person. I'm not really like Paul. You look at John, you look at the apostles, the disciples, you think, you know, they're all the poster people that we put up, you know, to be like them. But, you know, Paul actually says here, shows us a different list. Colossians 4, if you want to turn there. Verse 7. Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He's a beloved brother, faithful minister, fellow servant of the Lord. You know, he's just one who speaks, has a ministry of the word. Probably not a preacher, you know, just a guy who has a ministry of the word. You know, all of you, it's not just me, all of you have a ministry of the word. Starts after the service, starts this week. Have a ministry of the word to one another. Then you have Onesimus. Onesimus was Philemon's slave. He was a bit useless to begin with in the first part of his life, but then Paul actually commends him for becoming useful, for actually becoming faithful in the latter part of his life. Aristarchus, he was a prisoner with Paul. Aristarchus was someone who had his eye on the kingdom when all this persecution was happening. You know what? We need those. We need Aristarchuses among you. People with one eye on the kingdom, always on the kingdom, despite all the persecution that's happening. Mark. You list Mark there. Mark was actually responsible for the first church split, wasn't he? Remember in Acts? What made Paul and Barnabas separate and go their separate ways was Mark. A dispute rose up. But actually what you see here is Mark gets a second chance. He's the one who actually writes the gospel of Mark, according to Mark. And some of you guys here are stuffed up in a big way and you think, oh, I won't be able to make my life count. I've actually stuffed up too much. But someone like Mark, God used. Epaphras suffered greatly in his life. He struggled with incredible illness, almost to death. But Epaphras, he was a warrior. He struggled in prayer on behalf of other people. Luke was a doctor. What does Luke show us? Luke shows us that wherever you are in your workplace, whatever God has called you to in your workplace, use it for his glory. Make it count in the workplace. Then Paul talks about a lady called Nympha. Nympha opened up her house for a church to meet. She just opened up her home. These are the people that Paul celebrates. These are the unsung heroes. These people here make this whole message real for all of just people like us. And show us ways that we can make it count in our life. You don't have to know much. You don't have to be known much. You don't have to own much. If you want your life to count, pour it out. You know, the great paradox of this story is seen in Matthew and Mark's gospel again. You don't see it in John's gospel, but it's beautiful in Matthew and Mark's, is that Jesus looked on this woman who didn't have much at all. She didn't know much and all that sort of stuff. But he said this to her, "Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." And that's what we've just done this weekend. In fact, in many churches in the world right now, this weekend or any given weekend on a Sunday, this passage is probably preached somewhere in the world. And wherever it's preached, this woman is attached because of what she's done. She's attached to the gospel because of what she's done. That she's made her life count. She's poured it out. This is the great paradox of the story. You don't have to know much or be known much. But in fact, God, in the end, He will exalt you. He will exalt you. And even if it's not in this life, even if you're not recognized for what you know or what you've done, God will exalt you. He will be pleased. So live your life in a manner that is worthy of the gospel. This is what Jesus has done for you. Jesus poured it out on your rising need. And He poured it out willingly. He poured it out with thankfulness to His Father. He poured it out despite the cost. He poured it out through great criticism. And He did that for you. He did that to set your feet on solid ground.